Hello, and welcome back to the week 10 of our pre-placement course on React.js. In this session, we'll move one step further into understanding how React applications respond to user actions, specifically how they handle events and manage forms inputs, and how we can use conditional rendering to create dynamic responsive user interfaces. By the end of this session, you will not only understand how React captures user interactions, but also how to connect those interactions to your application state to make your UI respond intelligently. We'll also end with a hands-on demonstration where we will apply everything we learned today in building a simple but functional login page using React. Let's quickly go through what we'll cover in this part. We'll begin with event handling in React, where we'll understand how React captures and processes user actions like clicks, typing, or form submissions. Then we'll learn handling form inputs, where React allow us to fully control what a user types into an input field. This will help us implement forms in a consistent and predictable way. After that, we'll move to conditional rendering, where we decide what to show or hide on the screen based on what's happening in the application. Finally, we'll have a quick demonstration of these concepts through a login page example and end with some best practices that you should follow when writing React components and handle user interactions. Let's start with event handling in React. Every time a user interacts with a web page, for example, by clicking a button, typing text, or submitting a form, an event is fired. In React, events are handled slightly differently compared to plain JavaScript. React uses something called as synthetic events. A synthetic event is essentially a wrapper around the browser's native event system that makes event handling consistent across the browsers. For instance, if you have worked with vanilla JS script, you might use add event listener, click handler, or onClick. But in React, we will handle this by using JSX attributes like onClick, onChange, and onSubmit. These attributes are in camel case where we pass in a function and tells React what to do when the event occurs. Here's the example that is given at the bottom of the screen, where there is a button which has an on-click event, and within that there is a handle click with the button text as click. React will call the handle click function only when the button is actually clicked. The important thing to notice here is that we are not calling the function directly, we are passing a reference to it. That means React will execute it only when the event happens. This event object can tell you details like which element triggered the event or what the user typed. So event handling in React is powerful, clean, and consistent across all the browsers. Now let's look at handling form inputs. One of the most common tasks in web applications is dealing with input or user input as we call it. For example, getting the username and password from a login form. In React, we typically use something called as a controlled component. This means that instead of letting the browser manage what's inside an input field, we store the input value in React state and control it ourselves. Here's what it looks like into the code. Every time the user types into this input, the onChange event fires and the React updates the state with the latest value. The value attribute of the input is tied to the state variable, which means the displayed value is always synchronized with the React's internal state. This is called as two-way binding. The state controls the UI and the UI updates the state. It is very clean and predictable model for managing form data in React. Once we start handling user inputs and events, the next natural step is to make our UI respond based on these inputs. And that's where conditional rendering comes in. Conditional rendering simply means showing or hiding elements on your component based on certain conditions. React does not have special syntax for this. We just use normal JavaScript logics inside JSX. For instance, we can use the ternary operator like the one given here, which says if the is logged in is true, it would show dashboard component, or it would show a login form component. We can also use logical AND operator for simpler cases. For example, when you see the error, when the value of error is true, it will display the complete paragraph tag. Otherwise, it will not display anything. Conditional rendering is extremely useful in situations like showing login or logout buttons, displaying validation messages, or toggling features like password visibility. In our demonstration, we'll use this concept to show different messages based on whether the user enters the correct login credentials or not. Now that we have covered events, form inputs, and conditional rendering, let's bring it all together with a quick demonstration. This demo is an excellent way to see all the three topics in action, all within one small self-contained example. All right, welcome back. So in this demonstration, what I'm going to do is I'll give you a demonstration on how to handle input events and render things conditionally, right? Or the conditional rendering of various components or elements of the component. All right. So what we are going to do is we will continue with the same application that we have created in the last demo. The entire setup would remain the same, but I will create a new component which will deal with the content of this particular demonstration. All right. So what I'm going to do now is going to go to components folder and create a new file. Okay. So the file name is going to be form demo.jsx, form demo.jsx. So it is going to create a new empty file, which I'm going to use it for creating the components, right? So the first thing that I'm going to import is the use state hook because that is anyway required. So right, import use state from React. Right? I'll just increase the font for a better visibility. Okay, so now that we have imported a React, we will work with creating the function form demo. I try to keep the same name to the function itself. Okay, and obviously there is going to be certain uh, definition within this function, and finally we are going to export it, right? Export default form demo. All right, now I'll define this function here. Okay, so since I'm going to work with some form data, I will be using some form elements like username, password, and other things, right? So I'll just disable this for a minute. Okay, all right. So the first variable or the first state variable that I'm going to create is going to be the username, comma set username, right? So now you know that why it is given set username as the value, and right use state and initiate it with an empty string. Okay, with the same idea, I'll create password and another variable called message, right? So I'll just change these values now. Password, password, okay, and then message. All right. So the whole idea is to understand how form inputs are dealt with the help of a React. Okay. So with that said, I'll stop it here and then finally we'll return the JSX. Okay. I'm going to create div. Within this div, let's create an H2. Okay. And I will write a login form as its content. Okay. And then finally we'll create an HTML form, right? So it is going to be form. Okay. It is remove action. We don't need it. Okay. And then we will add various inputs to it. So we'll start off with a div. Within the div, there is going to be label. Okay. All right. Label, and label is going to be username. Now there is one thing to note here. Whenever you used to create label tag in the HTML core or pure HTML, it would create only the for attribute, right? It would create the for attribute. But in case of React, it is going to create this HTML for, which is a specific attribute for label tags used in XML. right? So since the React works with or it returns XML, this is the XML that we are writing. The attribute HTML for that is mentioned here will is a React specific attribute. Okay, instead of for we use HTML for, very similar to class, right? Instead of class we use class name. Okay, let me just minimize this. We don't need so long, right? So this is going to be the label, and I'll add a small BR tag here because I want the username actual input, the place where I put in the username to come to the next line. Okay, so this is going to be an input tag. Okay, type text. All right, and then finally, I'll come to the password later. But the next thing that I'm going to do is add a submit button. Right, so I will just create a button here. Okay, so going to be a button. Okay, button will have a text. Let's say login. Okay, and this is going to be of type submit. Right, remember uh, the type submit will actually submit the form. Right, it's going to be type submit. Okay, so what is going to happen at this stage? I have an element called form. Within this form, there is a first input which stands for username. It gives me a place to write username, and then finally it gives me a button to submit the form. Okay, let's see if this set of work, this set of code works. So for that, I'll save this, save the form demo component, and then instead of in the app.js, instead of state demo, I'll import the form demo. Right, so I'll write import form demo. So by default, it will import it from where it was, where it actually came from, and then right below this, I'll use form demo. Okay, either you use this or you use this. Both are one and the same thing. All right, and then since I do not need the state demo part, I'll just comment it. All right, let's save this and see what happens. Okay, so now what I'm going to do is run this application because obviously if it does not run, then it will not give me anything anyways. It is going to be npm run dev. Okay, so my application is running and I think it is already open, so I don't need to, rerun it. I'll just refresh it. Take some time to refresh. Yeah. So you can see that there's a login form created here. Let me just increase the font. Do we have something here? Yeah, I think so. Yeah, it will work. Right? So one, two. Yeah. So we have the login form here. All right. Now let me see if it allows me to add something, right? Let's say if I add my name. Okay. It is allowing me to write. Okay. At this point, it is allowing me to write. Let me just click on login and see what happens. All right. So what happened actually? Nothing happened, right? So one thing you can observe is, let me just try it again. Others and click on login. What happens is the entire page gets reloaded. All right. The entire page gets reloaded when I'm writing on the name and then click on login. Okay. The reason for that is we'll go to our form demo and see what the reason can be for that. All right. Okay. And before I give you the reason for that, let me also add one more thing here. Name equals to username. Okay. So this will help me deal with it, right? So let's say if I write this demo, right? So let us reload this page. Okay. Page reloaded. Let me type in the name and click on login. Okay. So what happens? Two things happen here. First is, as of now, whenever I write anything, not only name, anything if I write here and click on login, the entire page gets reloaded. Right? This is not what I'm trying to do. I don't want to reload the page when I'm filling the form or when I'm submitting the form. That is first thing. The second thing that is happening is the moment I give the name attribute, what happens is the value that I've added in the input field is starting to get concatenated with the URL, right? So in the URL tab, you can see that the value has been taken from here and pushed to the URL tab, right? So what can be the reason for these two things? Okay, let me tell you with the help of the explanation, right? So you see what we have created here is a form element, right? Now, when you create a form element, you expect two things in the attribute of form. What do you expect in the attribute of form? One is the action. Okay, one is the action that you expect to put in the form attribute, in the form element, and the second attribute that you put is the method. Okay, the second attribute that you put is the method. So generally, what we do is we provide a URL here. We provide a URL here in the action attribute, and in the method we generally provide post. Okay, so generally provide the post method. Okay, so what is expected to happen? Whenever you click on this button, login, the form should get submitted onto this URL with post method. All right. The moment you remove both of these things, the moment of where you remove both of these things, the URL will be taken by default as hash. Okay, this means the page will reload. Okay, since you have not put action attribute here, the page will reload, the form will be submitted, and the page will be reloaded. Since you have not mentioned the method equals to post, the default method that will be taken will be get, right? And in get method, generally, whenever you submit any payload with get method, the payload gets concatenated with the URL as query parameters. Okay, so that was the reason we were facing or we were observing these two things, right? So first thing was the form was getting submitted. Okay, because the form did not know where to go or which endpoint of it, that is the reason it gets reloaded. That is the first thing. And second thing is, since the method was also not mentioned, the parameters will be pushed to the URL as query parameters. Okay, so they will get concatenated to the URL as query parameters. This is something that we do not want to do, right? This is not our intention. What is our intention? To add a attribute, add a value to it, click on login, and it should then go to the backend, right? It should then go to the backend with whatever method we mentioned. That is what we want to do, right? So what is the default behavior of form if you do not do anything? The default behavior of form is that it will submit the form to the given action attribute with the given method, right? That is the default behavior of a form. We don't want this default behavior to happen. That is the reason we will create a method that handles how submit should happen. Okay, that will create how the submit should happen. It will handle the way submit or what should happen when the submit button is clicked or the login button is clicked. Right. So what we are going to do is we are going to create this variable called handle submit. Handle submit. All right. And obviously this is going to be a function. So I will be creating uh, an arrow function here. Okay. So this is going to be the definition of arrow function. Okay, so the first thing is we are going to do is we will pass on the event. So whenever you submit the form, you have the submit event recorded, right? You have the submit event recorded. This submit event, which is recorded, can be fetched within the definition of function with E, whichever variable you want, right? So you can create E, event, this event, right? Whatever you want, whatever variable name suits you. Generally, we will do it with E, all right? And what do I want with this event? I want this event or I want this form submission to not go by default behavior, right? So what I will do is I'll write E dot prevent default, E dot prevent default. All right. This means whenever I click on the submit, my form will not reload it. Reload the page itself and it will not go with the get method. These two things are the default behavior of form is hindered with this, right? That is the first thing I need to do. To verify this, what I'll do is I'll simply console.log this, right? Console.log. Okay, form submitted. Okay, just a feedback messages or just a feedback message that tells us that instead of submitting the form and this and that happening, we have submitted the way we have defined in the application. That is one thing. All right, and obviously this function should trigger on what event? Not on the click event, on the form submit event, right? So here within the form, we will create this at this synthetic event called onSubmit. Okay, so this onSubmit is going to handle my handle prevent. Sorry, handle submit. Handle sub. Okay, so what is going to happen now when I click on submit? The submit will happen. The submit will trigger this handle submit because the event is not only click, it is the submit event. All right, it's not only click, it is click is a half event in this point. What is actually happening? We are trying to submit the form. So when I click on submit, the entire form is submit. So what should happen once the form gets submit? Right? So if I write the click event, the event will not be captured, right? So the event should be captured with handle submit because we're trying to handle the submit. We are trying to handle the on submit event. All right. Once you do this, let's see. Let me save it and see what happens. Okay. So one change here. There has to be a this has to be a method, right? So we prevent report, which is going to be a method. Right. Now let's just save it and see. Uh, the name. Click on login. Right. So you can see now the form is submitted. Okay, so the form submit. So it is now not reloading, neither it is reloading nor the value is getting concatenated as a URL parameter. Right. So now the default behavior of the form is changed. That is one thing. All right. Now let us try to get the username, right? So simply, logging the form submitted will not work. You want to take the username. All right. Okay, let's see. Okay, so for that, what I'm going to do is right below the form, I'm going to write, let's say outputs. Let's say H2 or result. Okay, then we are going to use a couple of paragraph elements. Right, username is colon, and to access the username, we'll write username. Okay, so as of now, since we have only username, let's use the username, and then we will save this. Okay. All right, so it says username is right. So the moment I click on login, it gives the form submitted. Right, I clicked on login, I put in the value, I clicked on login, it gave me form submitted. Ideally, this username should have been populated with the word that I've mentioned here. Right? So, but that is not happening. What can be the reason? Let's see. So I've mentioned this username. So whatever is the value of username should come here. Okay. And where is this username coming from? From the form. This means my username input field must be somewhere connected with the state variable username. Right. So here, if you see, instead of name, I should write value. Right. If I write value equals to and then try to write username, let's see if this works. Right. So I have a value with its given username. So the state variable was put here correctly, right? It was used here as a state variable, but the input element, the username that I was using in the input element was not connected or not configured with our state variable, right? So it was not configured with a state variable. So what is going to happen here? I'll write the value here and then attach it to the username given the state variable like this. Let's see what happens. Okay, if you just want to verify that my value or the username state variable is now attached with the input username, we can just put a default value here. Let's say unknown. All right, if I just save unknown, write unknown and save it, let's see what happens. So I'll go to the front end and see unknown, right? So you can see that the unknown is coming here also and here also. How are these two populated? Because the state variable allows it. The state variable that I've defined is now connected with the input element. Okay. Now let me try to change it. Okay. You can see that I'm trying to erase it, but this is not getting erased, right? If I'm trying to add it, add a new value to it, it is not getting added, right? Let me first remove this unknown for you and save it. Right? So as of now, I will not see anything in the form, and here also I won't be seeing anything, right? But if I try to add something in the input field, if I try to add something in the input field, nothing happens. Okay, why is that happening? Because obviously we see some error here, but what are these errors? We will see. We'll try to understand it. Again, to understand it, we should go to the basics and see to the fact and note the fact that the state variable of a React cannot be mutated directly, right? The state variable of React cannot be mutated directly. That is the reason what is happening here. Whenever I'm trying to put some value in the input tag, this input tag is trying to change the value of the username. which is in turn trying to change the value of the state variable. So what are we trying to do here indirectly? We are trying to indirectly mutate the state variable, which is not allowed in React, right? So there has to be a better way, or there has to be a correct way to do that, right? And what is the correct way? The way, that way which not mutates but replaces the state variable, right? So we need to find a way that with every change in the input field replaces the state variable with the actual value in the input field, right? Let me reiterate this statement. We'll have to find a way replace which will replace the state variable with the value put in the input field, right? That is what is happening. That is what we call it as two-way binding, right? Two-way binding in the React. So let us see how do we do that. Okay, now focus on the word when there is a change in the input element. So that is what we are trying to capture. Okay, so what, instead of simply writing value, we will also add an event which is called as onChange event. Okay, so this onChange event will be something that will capture every change in the input element, every change in the character of the input, whether it is adding of a character or removing of a character from the input field. Whether you type a character into the input field or you remove a character by pressing on backspace, or that change has to be captured. So I want to trigger set username function. I want to trigger set username function with every change in my input field. Okay, so I'll just take this onChange event here. And since we are working on event, I will pass on the event attribute. I'll create an arrow function. Okay, before I do that, I'll create an arrow function. Okay, and what is going to happen? This arrow function will be taken the event. What this e represents? This e represents the change event that is captured by this onChange method or attribute, right? And then what are we going to do with this change event? We'll write set username. Okay, and what is going to be the value of set username? That value which is currently the value of input element, right? So how do we access that? We'll access that by e dot target dot value, right? So the target where the event is occurred, value of the target where the event is occurred. Okay, that is what we are going to note with this onChange event. Okay, so what is going to happen? The moment the value is put in the input tag, that value will trigger. What will it trigger? It will trigger the set username method, which will replace the existing value. In our case, it is empty string. It will replace the existing value, empty string, with a new value added in the input form. If I add a new character to it, the new value in the input will be replacing the old value, which is the first character. Right? Let us see that in action. Okay, I'll just save this, and then we'll go to the form. All right, and now let me just reload this. Now let's see if I put A. You see, the moment I put A, what happened? The old value, which was an empty string, first thing that happened is the change event. So the empty value in the input field now got replaced by the A, which is a change. This change was triggered. This change was captured by the onChange event, which then triggered the set username function. And within that, what did we put? It should take the value from the target and then put it to username, right? And the same thing has been put to the username. That is the reason here also I can see username is A, right? Now the next character is going to be, let's say, D. So what happened? The new value AD is replacing the old value A. That is how we handle the onChange event and form inputs in React. All right. At the so I mean, with every code that we are seeing, with every methodology that we are seeing, sorry, with every methodology we are seeing, we are maintaining a fact that a state variable of React cannot be mutated. It cannot be modified. It can only be replaced. So, and how it can be replaced? Only by the modifying function. Okay, or the function that replaces it. Okay, so with that understanding, I will proceed with the password now. That is the reason I did not write password initially, because I know once you understand the username part, the password part will be easy. Right. So what I'll do is I'll just copy this part. All right, and then instead of, I'll make the changes multiple places, right? So first thing, I should have mentioned username here. Okay, and also mention the ID here. Okay, not required for the demonstration, but yes, you should follow it because This will help you with the styling and other things. All right, that is one thing. Here I'll write password. Here I write password, and here in the instead of username, I write password. All right. And here also I'll write password. Okay. And then finally, we will be instead of triggering set username here, we'll be triggering set password. Okay. So these are the two things. And then finally, here also we'll mention what exactly happened. So username is whatever username we filled in the input tag, and password is whatever password you filled. Password is password. Okay. So I hope this is clear. Let us take a demonstration of this also. We'll put both of the things and try to submit it. Okay. So let's replace this. Others. Okay. And here I'll write password. So let's say React 123. All right. So you can see that now my input, user input in the form are linked with the state variables and are properly altering the state. Okay. Now if I click on login, what is happening here? The submit form function is getting triggered, right? The submit form functionality is getting triggered, and that should appear here. Okay, but now we'll make a sense of it, right? Instead of simply consoling or logging something on the console, we will try to make a sense of it. Okay, so what we'll do is we'll write a condition, a very simple condition that verifies the validation. Okay, if username equals to others, okay, and I mean we are going to check both of the conditions, right? And password equals to React 123. If username is others and the React password is React 123, then I will set this message. So you now know the third variable that we have used, right? So then we'll set the message like this: set message. Okay, and the value of that is going to be user login successful. User login successful. Welcome. Okay, and then we'll write an else condition. If any of these things fail, right? We'll set the message to something else, right? So what is going to be the message? Login failed, invalid credentials. Okay, let us test this. And obviously I need to display this message somewhere, right? So right below our username and password, I'll just print the message, right? As I'll print message in a slightly larger font, right? Message. Okay, let us check this. Okay, I'll refresh the complete component, right? So write name as others and value as React123. Okay, now if I click on login, what should happen? User login successful, welcome, right? By any chance, if I remove or change the password and I click on login, it says login credentials failed, invalid. All right. So this is how we treat the form. Now let us very quickly see how do we handle or how do we do a conditional rendering in React, right? So we will be using a couple of things. One is uh, the the ternary operator, all right, and then the question mark and colon format, right? So the ternary operators and double and operators we are going to see. Okay, we will see the two use cases of this. We'll see the two use cases. Let us come to that now. So what I want to do is let us go into the code and check. All right. So what I want to do is I want to give this message, right? So this message as of now is a default white color message at this point, right? So what I want to do is if the message, if the login is successful, then if the login is successful, then what I'm going to do is show the entire message in green color. If the login is unsuccessful, I'll show the entire message in red color. And if the login, I mean, if nothing is happening, if the component is just loaded, just mounted, I don't want to show anything, right? So I want to show message only if there is an action of login. I mean, the action of login has happened. Okay. And if the action of login has happened based on whether the credentials were correct, I want to show a different message in green color. And whether the login message was incorrect or the login credential were incorrect, I want to show a failed login with a different color. So this is a conditional rendering that I want to do, right? So how do I do that? Initially, I mean, you will always see that if you if you reload the entire component, okay, you won't see anything here at the bottom, right? So when you load the component, you won't see anything. But let's say if I go to the console, if I go to the elements, right? If I go to the elements and then go to the body and within the div, you can see that an empty h2 is still getting created, right? You can see that here, the empty h2 is still getting created. I don't want that empty h2 itself to come because there is no message as such. I want that h2 only to come whenever there is a message, whether there is a login happened or there is an unsuccessful login. So that message should come only when a login action has happened, right? What that message is the second thing, but that message should first come only when the login action has happened. Okay, so how do I deal with that? Okay, for this we are going to use the double and notation. Okay, for this we are going to use the double and notation. How do we do that? So this is the part that I want to, sorry, this is the part that I want to show. Only the message part is the part that I want to show, right? So how am I going to do it is first, I will create a block. Okay, I'll create an expression. All right. Within this, I'll write message. Okay. And then I'm going to use double and notations. Okay. And within the double and notations, within the double and notations, I'll create this expression. Okay, and obviously this is a code block, so not the round bracket. This has to be a single parenthesis. So whenever you want to create a JavaScript code block within the XML, you just give it by single notation. All right. Now what should come within this? What should come within this is the actual H2 message that you want to mention. Okay, so I'll just remove it from here and I'll paste it here. Okay. Let's better the make the syntax proper. So what is happening here? This entire block, this entire expression will only be rendered only if there is message. If the message does not have anything, if it is an empty string, or if it has any falsy value, then this entire message block will not be rendered. Okay, so this is a conditional rendering or the first part of conditional rendering that I want to demonstrate. All right, let us see this and refresh. All right. So again, you see that, okay, there is a login form, username, password, result, and nothing is shown in the message. But the change that has happened is this. Go to div and div, and you can see username, password, and nothing. The H2 is not yet loaded. Unless and until there is a message, the H2 will not be loaded. Now let me try to log in and see what happens. Right. So I'll write the name and the password. Like 123. All right. So the username is changing according to the variable, password is changing according to the variable. Now click on login. Now you see that the message has appeared. Okay, even in the div, yeah, right below the result, right? So this H2 user login success, user login successful. Welcome. So this H2 will appear only if the value of message is a truly value. Otherwise, it will not be appearing. Okay, so this is the one thing. Now the second thing is based on whether the login was successful or not, we will be writing the style, right? Whether the login was successful or not, we'll be writing the style. Okay, so how do we do that? For that, what I'm going to do is I'll be using the ternary operators like question mark and colon, right? So what I'll be doing it, right? I'll create a new state variable called logged in, logged in. All right, and what is going to be the message that changes the set logged in. Okay, and the initial value I'll set it to false. Okay, obviously when nothing has happened, nobody has logged in, the initial value is going to be false. All right, so const logged in, set logged in, use state false. Okay, now we are going to modify this value when first here. Okay, so we are going to modify the value here. If the login is successful, we will keep the set logged into true. Right, if the value, I mean the credentials are matching, then we will put the value to true, else we'll keep it as false. Okay, so this is the place where we'll be modifying the value of logged in. All right, and how do you use this variable? So you see set logged in is used, but how do you use this variable? This variable will be used to set up the condition. Okay, now what is going to be the condition? The condition is where I'll write this. Right, so within this h2. Okay, so I have an h2 written here, and what am I trying to do? I'm trying to color the h2 element, so I'll write the style. Okay, I'll give it the style attribute. Okay, and this style attribute will have a code block. This style attribute will have a code block, right? So what is this style attribute going to have? It is going to have color. Okay, this style attribute is going to have color. All right. Okay. Okay. Let me turn off the recommendations. I don't want this. Yeah. So I want to add a style attribute. So I'll add a style attribute here. Okay. Within this style attribute, I'll give color. Okay, now this color's value will depend on what? It will depend on the state variable that we have created here. What is the state variable? Is logged in, or sorry, logged in, right? So I'll write logged in, right? So if the value of logged in is true, if the value of logged in is true, I will have green color as output. Sorry, green color as the value. Okay, the value of color should be green. If it is not, if the logged in value still stays false, it will remain red, right? So this is my entire block. This is my entire styling. And this styling, since again is having a JavaScript block, this has to be encompassed in a single curly bracket again, right? So you note that this is not a double curly braces. It is an object encompassed, or a JavaScript object encompassed inside a single curly braces, because that is how we write a dynamic part in the React XM. All right. So what is happening here? So what is happening here? The color value, the style, this entire thing is the block, right? So the color value will depend on logged in value. If the logged in value is true, the value of color will be green. If the logged in value is false, the value of color will be red. All right. So this is going to be my condition. This is going to be the value of that style object that I provide here. And then everything is encompassed in a single curly braces. And finally, I see a message. Okay. Let us save this and see. Okay. I'll put the username. I'll put the password, React 123. Click on login. So everything is coming in green color. Why is that? Because both of the things are matching, right? So by any chance, if I change the password, okay, and then I try to log in, it will still remain green. Why is that? Even though the conditions are not matching and everything, it says login failed invalid credentials, but it never turns red. Why is that? Because now if I go to the code and see, the set login sets to true after once the condition is false. Condition is matching, right? Once the condition becomes true, the set value of set login is set to true. Now this will not become false unless and until the component is reloaded, right? So we need a way to set it as false, and this is the place where we'll set it as false, right? So we'll write set logged in false. Unless and until you make the set login false, the condition will always remain true once it became true, right? So now if I save this and then I check the front end, now if I click in, now you can see that it has become red, right? So what is happening here? Once the condition, that is once the credentials, username and password match, the logged in part should be set to true. But for any reason, if it is not matching, then it should be again reset to false. That will help us to toggle between the red and green color, right? So what you have seen in this particular demonstration is how do you handle form input without violating the rule of React that the state cannot be mutated, right? So you then handled or you then came across an on change event and how to use on change event. That is one thing. The second thing is we saw the conditional rendering wherein a particular variable or a particular block of code will be rendered only when a state variable is true or false. In our case, it is the message. If the message is empty, the entire block will not be loaded. If the message has some value, doesn't matter what it is, it will be loaded. Okay. The second step to that is once the message is loaded, depending on whether the login was successful or not, it will load the message in a different style, right? So that style will be applied based on what is the value of logged in variable, right? So we have used the double and the question mark and colon notations to define the conditional rendering. Okay. One additional thing or optional thing that you can do is, I mean, generally you will see in any application form is you put in the credentials and the moment you click on submit, irrespective of whether they were right or wrong, you get the fields cleared, right? So you clear these fields once the form is submitted. So that is the final thing that we'll do in this demonstration. Okay, so what do we do it? We'll set the username. We'll set username to an empty string. That is the first thing we'll do. And the second thing that we'll do is we'll set the password also to an empty string. Okay, so this gives a better feedback to the user or a better user experience to the client that whenever you add some value to the form and you click on submit button of the form, the fields of the form should get a reset by default, right? So this is how we will check final thing. All right, so now I have nothing in the component. I'll write my credentials, React 123. And if I click on login, I see that the user login successful welcome message has appeared and my form fields have been reset to none, right? So that I can add new user name and new password. Okay. So with that, I will end this demonstration and I hope this is clear. Thank you. Now we'll move back to the slides. Before we wrap up, let's go over some best practices for event handling and conditional rendering in React. First, always try to keep your components simple and your event handlers focused on a single responsibility. Even if an event needs to do multiple things, split those actions into smaller functions for better readability. Second, avoid using deeply nested conditional statements inside your JSX. If your render logic becomes complex, it is a good idea to extract parts of it into smaller style components. This keeps your code cleaner and easier to maintain. Finally, when you use conditional rendering, make sure your logic is easy to follow. Remember, clarity is more important than cleverness. If someone else can quickly understand what conditions control your UI, that's a sign of well structured React code. And that brings to the end of this session. Thank you.